Hi, and welcome to the Reclamation Project podcast. We are so glad that you're here, that you are listening, and hopefully that you're a part of the conversation. Today, we are going to continue our discussion on relationships and love and marriage. And in the last couple of weeks, we started talking about a hard subject, which is divorce. And today, we're going to continue going down that path. And it's really hard for us, to tell you the truth, because we feel that with divorce, it's never God's intention for anyone to have to go through divorce. And the truth is, it's probably not been your intention if you have been divorced. Mm-hmm. That's not what you went into the relationship with. That's not what you wanted for your relationship. But for some of you, you have found yourself in a place where you are now divorced. And so the question is where do you go? What do you do? For a lot of people who have gone through this, there is heartache, there is pain, there is disbelief, and just a moment of not understanding what's going on and trying to piece all those things together and figure out, how did I get here? Where am I? And so that's where we kind of want to pick up with this next conversation, is just, what do we do now that this has all happened? How do we gather ourselves? How do we move on? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? For a lot of people, there's no game plan necessarily as to where they're going and what they're doing. For some, it's just get back up on the horse and start dating and get married again. And for others, it's I'm free. Now I can do whatever I want. I can, go to the furthest ends of the earth and do whatever I dang well please. And for some, it's confusion of, well, what am I supposed to do now? Yeah. And so that's where we want to start and really talk through what to do next. Yeah. I just want to throw a disclaimer real quick. And I've said this a few times with all of our relationship and love and marriage podcast, is if this doesn't fit you, I think it's still important to listen. If you're not in this place of divorce, it's still important to listen. And here's the reason why specifically this podcast is: you may know someone who has gotten divorced recently or has been divorced for a while. And I think it's important that if that is you, that there's a couple things that are your responsibility. One is that you not judge that person. I think that happens far too often. And you not judge that person through the divorce. You not judge that person after the divorce. That you not gossip about them. That is also another thing that I see happen quite often. But your role should be one of reconciliation, one of love, one of lifting people up, and then as they move through what we're going to talk about, that you are their sounding board, that you are their helper. If they're a close friend, that you help them walk through this journey. And so I would say that if you're listening and you are not in this spot, but you know someone who is, this will help you understand maybe where they are going and where they have come from and what their needs are. So please continue to listen, continue to hear what we're saying, and also, use it with friends as you see them walk through these things that we're going to talk about.
And I wanted to piggyback for just a moment and really kind of affirm your introduction preamble to this isn't a theological discussion and breakdown of divorce. We know what the word says about it. Let me tell you that it's not the unpardonable sin. I was talking with the pastor this week, letting him know what our podcast was going to be about, and he said if I had to take a really super hardline stand on divorced people and remarried people, I would lose most of my leaders and half of my praise team. So it's not the unpardonable sin, and there's forgiveness even for that if you were the offender. So much like you said in your introduction, we're not talking about the theological construct of divorce. We're saying, as you said, Jeremy, here you are, you find yourself in a place you never wanted to be.
And so here you are, and there's a lot of questions. And so I think the first step, and let me also preface this with a little bit of Gary and I haven't been through this. We know people who have.
Together or separately.
Yes.
We haven't, yes.
And Gary's counseled people who have, and I have friends who have been through this, and family members as well. The perspective that we're bringing is from that very perspective. So for some of you, you may say, you just don't get it. But I think there is some truth to what we're bringing. So back in to where we were is you find yourself divorced. And I think the first thing is that you know, many people are just kind of confused. They're shell shocked. They've been maybe run through the ringer. And so I think the first step in recovering from this, not to be recovered, but to be in recovery, is just figuring out your mess, figuring out what's gotten you to that place, figuring out what has happened. Not saying that there's something wrong with you, but there's obviously even you know, when soldiers go off to war, they come back changed.
Yeah.
Because they've gone through this traumatic time.
Yeah.
If you find yourself divorced, you've gone through this traumatic time. And so there's something to the fact of gathering your bearings, figuring out what's happened to you, figuring out what issues have resulted from that,
Yep.
How it's changed you, and how you can grow from that.
I think, as in most areas, step number one really should be in forgiveness. You got to ask you have to ask God to forgive your partner, forgive yourself if you were part of the problem, and sometimes you have to forgive God because this went totally against my plan as a 13-year-old girl when I had a picture cutouts of my whole life and my picket fence and my 3.5 children and my my Lincoln Navigator with 4 car seats. And so I think it starts with forgiveness, asking forgiveness of your partner and for yourself. And then now we have a foundation, at least, to move to the next step.
And I think that's really important because, you know, I've seen some people, how do I put this? I've seen some people that have been miserable for years, if not a lifetime, because they haven't taken the step to go through forgiveness and to figure out what happened, and how it's changed them, and how to move on from it, which is forgiveness. I mean, how to move on from it is putting it behind you, and putting behind you is a form of trying to forgive and move on from it.
Yeah, and maybe you were the wronged party, and you were totally biblically and socially and just in your divorce. Yet the pain comes, and to hold on to that unforgiveness, and unforgiveness only leads to bitterness. I think we've mentioned before, T.D. Jakes, the African-American preacher, loves to say, unforgiveness is like me drinking poison and hoping you die. That's a horrible scenario. And that's what bitterness and unforgiveness does. It only reinforces the pain you just went through, and you just can't move on until that is put to bed.
Well, and I think another part of this too is possibly just getting with somebody who is a counselor, who is a life coach, who is somebody who can work you through this, a mediator, pastor,
maybe someone who's been through it before,
a mentor.
Yeah.
But I think with that, there's also just unresolved issues. There's forgiveness, and then there's figuring out how you got there. You know, maybe it's something from when you were 13.
Correct. Yeah.
That has gotten you there, how you've trusted or not trusted, or how you've done certain things differently because of something that somebody wronged you when you were 13. So understanding the issues that got you to that point will help you move on in the future so that you don't have a similar outcome.
Yeah.
You know, I think Gary brought up that what was the percentage of second divorces?
Yeah, the new stats are like 47% of first marriages end divorce. Excuse me, 67 to 68% of second marriages end in divorce.
So I think that 20% and I'm not speaking for the whole 20%, but I think a good portion of that's probably because issues haven't been resolved. Forgiveness hasn't been made. People haven't dove into what got them there, what got them to that point. Maybe because they're afraid that the finger might point at them. Maybe it's because they're afraid that they may not like the outcome of what comes up in those unresolved issues. But I think it's important that if you find yourself in divorce, that you figure out what went wrong, that you figure out how to forgive, and that you figure out how to move past it.
And then we've talked about reframing on almost every podcast. So to reframe that, when I sit with a couple that's either both or one or both have been married in the past, now they're getting remarried, I'll always ask this question: what lessons did you learn from your first marriage?
Yes.
Both good and bad. What lessons did you learn? And it really does revert back to one of our first podcasts on this series. I'll bet you'll find that some of the issues were that unchecked baggage that we just didn't work on. And again, that's maybe why you don't want to work through it, because you know that it's still active baggage in your life.
Yeah. And I think that's important, because then you get your mind in a right state of mind. You get your mind in a right place. There's a sportscaster, I think it might have been the new ASU coach, Herb Edwards.
Herb Edwards?
Herb Edwards,
yeah.
Herb, that said, get your mind right.
Get your mind right.
And,
get your mind right.
I think that's what people who have gone through divorce, they need to go through all of this forgiveness, this working through of baggage, this working through of unresolved issues, to get their minds right. So you may need to get your mind right.
So I guess the question, the next right question would be, what does that mean, and what does that look like to get your mind right? And I think we've already covered step one, which is forgiveness. And step two is being able to, I think, take a step back and look at your marriage, the good places, the bad places, and the final end of it from a totally objective place, and say, what could I have done right? What could I have done better? What could they have done? And then again to say, because of that, I move forward with these points. In a counseling session, we would call that positive blaming, because even through some of the negative things, you get a positive result. My ex-husband was cruel and unattentive. So because of that, what did you do? Well, I learned how to become self-sufficient, and I stopped being so needy. Okay, those are good things. You have to thank your ex-spouse for that. So when you work through some of those issues, you have to identify them, you forgive them, and you extract from them the positive lessons.
And that is so important, because as you realize and work through unresolved issues and baggage and why things went wrong, and what characteristics that your spouse had that and how they impacted you positively or negatively, I think that can really help you in kind of the next part of life that may happen for some of you, which is dating again, and trusting people in a relationship again. And that really helps in the fact that once you identify those parts of that person and how they moved you and changed you and hurt you and helped you, it'll help you not to pick those negative characteristics in the next person that you date.
Yeah, there's a greater awareness of that then.
And so often I see it in dating relationships, and I see it in people who've gotten divorced and are dating again and getting in relationships again. They pick the very same person, just with a different name, when they go to date again. Yeah. And it's just so frustrating. I remember growing up and seeing girls through high school do this, and they would complain about this guy, how they treated them, and how they felt unloved in a dating relationship. And then the next guy that they date would do this exact same thing. Yeah. And so I think in the same way is people coming into a time of, hey, I'm finding myself divorced, you can do the same thing and find, if you don't resolve those issues, if you don't find those positives and negatives and work through the baggage and do all the things that we just talked about, when you go to date, there's a large possibility that you may find that same exact person just with a different name and a different hairstyle.
Yeah, and if you were to pick up the string and follow it back to the origin point again, you'll find that it's because it's a piece of the baggage that you hadn't worked on. Example, if you're insecure and incredibly needy, and that what really was a hard part in your marriage that might have contributed to your divorce, and if you haven't worked on that, you're still subject to being needy and having someone come by and say the right words to make you feel good, who's still not right for you. The two things I see people mostly do when they get divorced and they start to redate or remarry, they either say, I've learned my lesson on the faults of my ex-spouse and I know a better way to fix it. By the way, that's a false thought. Or you think, this is who my ex-spouse was, and so I'm going to get the exact opposite. That must be the ticket. And that's not correct either. I mean, you were attracted to the first one for a reason. So to pick all the opposites isn't logical either. It does come back to, before I move on, I have to understand me and be a better version of me.
And for some of you, you've found out that you know the best version of you. You know who you are. You've gone through all this inventory and knowing your baggage and knowing these unresolved issues and knowing your ex-partner and ex-spouse and you find yourself and you say, I am ready to date.
Yep.
Again, we're not going into a theological study on
Correct.
what that means and all, but if you're ready to date, for some of you that's difficult because you have kids. Mm-hmm. And with that, I would definitely say that kids probably make it harder. Now, I'm going to come from the perspective of someone who is dating a person with kids because I've actually had two people that I've dated when I was single, of course.
That worked out well.
That worked. Yeah. That's the best time to date is when you're single.
Correct.
So I dated two people who had kids. And I tell you what, my first rule in that, and I don't know how I came up with this, but I did, and I think it's a great rule, is I don't want to meet your kids. Mm-hmm. And it's not because I don't like kids. It's not because I don't I don't want any kind of relationship there. But at the same time, I don't want any type of relationship there.
Yeah.
And the reason is because when the person that you're dating meets your kids, there is a level of almost permanency there.
Yeah, for a child.
Because that child will form a relationship with that person as well. And I've seen this a couple different times.
Yep.
I've had a couple friends go through this. One got divorced, started dating a guy. They were together for a few years, and her kids got so attached, and then they broke up. And when they broke up, that just caused so many issues with her kids, and it really was almost like a second divorce.
Absolutely.
For their kids.
To them, there's no distinction between that. The feeling was the same.
Yeah, and there's no distinction between dating someone for a while and this is my new stepdad. Is because they feel like that person's around, that person's involved, that person's part of that.
They've been re-traumatized again.
Exactly, and that's what we have to kind of guard against. Is not only because it's the same for our kids as it is for us, in that there's a trauma there when you break up with someone who you have feelings for, who you have dated for a while. There's that trauma, but the trauma that I think is so much unspoken and unseen is the trauma that it brings to someone's kids. Yeah. And so that's why I didn't want to have that. And luckily we didn't get far enough down those relationships to really figure that part out. But that was the rule that I had. I had another friend who I saw they had been together for, a long time, probably like 5 or 6 years, and abruptly broke up. And I don't know the situation with her kids, but her kids probably went through that same trauma.
Oh, I would get. Yeah.
And luckily they got back together, but the trauma of that breakup, and now I don't have that relationship with this person who is my father figure. To a certain extent, the father may still be around, but this person's a secondary father figure at that point. So with that, they have that trauma as well. I'd also say it's important not to bring someone around your kids too, is because you have to figure out, is that person the person that I want raising my kids? That I want co-parenting my children, because I think, and this may not be everyone's thing, but I think dating really means that you are going to possibly marry this person. And if you marry, that person becomes step parent. And you need to know whether or not you trust that person to raise your kids. And I think that's important to figure out before they meet your kids.
And, and to your point, which is a great point about not meeting the kids, to the flip side of that is sometimes you build such a bond with the kids that really you're ready to break up with the person you're dating. In fact, I have a guy that's in that right now. I'm counseling. They met the kids. He fell in love with the kids. He loves the kids, and maybe he thinks the relationship's right, but he doesn't want to break up with the kids. So, to your point, there's bonds being built all across the board, and before we do any of those introductions, we better make sure a lot of the dots are connected before that happens.
And I would say, in addition to that, the other thing is aside from your kids, is as you start dating, you really need to set boundaries, which we talked about a few podcasts ago, but set the boundaries of intimacy, spiritual, emotional, physical, which again we talked about a few podcasts ago. But I think you need to set those different boundaries, because to a certain extent you have to guard yourself. You have to keep your guard up, because you don't, as you're getting back into the dating pool, and I hate to use that term, but that's what comes to mind at 10 o'clock in the morning. But as you get into the dating pool, I think that it's important to guard yourself, because there's so many people out there that can hurt you. And whether you want to admit it or not, coming off of a divorce, you may be vulnerable to that. You may be looking for compassion. You may be looking for love. You may be looking for someone who to fill the void that your ex-spouse used to fill. And you want that compassion. You want that partnership. You want that couple feel. And so I think it's important to guard yourself and really set boundaries, and also set a list of what you want in someone, and don't compromise that list. And that's the way to guard yourself as well, that this is really what I'm looking for in a person to complete me. And that is the person I'm going to look for to date. And if there's something that I see that doesn't lend to that list or detracts from that list, it may be a deal breaker, and I need to get out before I get too deep.
And if you don't plan for that, I'm sitting with a young lady, and I know she listens to the podcast, and she's given me permission to say this. So she's struggling right now with a breakup of, they didn't get married. And as we're working through this litany of lists she put together of why it's important to break up, I said, didn't these look as red flags to you during the dating period? She said, yes. I said, so what do you do with red flags? She goes, well, I told myself any more than 10 red flags, I wouldn't pursue that.
10?
Yeah. And she goes like, wow, how many red flags do you think should be limit? I said, I like 0. I like to start with 0, and maybe I have a grace period of 1. But if you have 10 red flags before, red flags are the signal. They're a sign. They're a warning, you know. And so, what confuses that, to your point, Jeremy, is when you allow yourself to be unchecked and unguarded and get too emotions lie to you.
I was going to say that's what allows red flags, is
Absolutely.
You get emotionally, even spiritually, maybe even physically intimate. And therefore those red flags become, hey, you know what? I can live with that. I can live with that. Again, compromising your list,
Correct.
compromising what you desire in a partner.
Right. Or we already slept together, so we might as well just go ahead and get married, because if you're a believer now, you feel guilt. It's probably the biggest thing to believers that are redating, get ready to remarry face is that sexual tension, because they've already experienced that, and you can't unring that bell, and those desires are there, and so your boundary, which is a great point, Jeremy. So your boundaries might be, I know my weakness and I know my emotions. I know what my empty tank needs, but I'm just not going to allow myself to be caught in a position where that could happen. Maybe it's a boundary as simple as that.
And I have a buddy who he went through a divorce a few years back, and he told me a little bit ago. He said, what the hardest thing about dating again is even the Christian girls, even the girls that I find in church, the concept of boundaries in sex are just not there. And so he's had to stop dating girls. He's had to walk away from relationships because too tempting, too far, too whatever.
And girls know that sex is the ultimate bear trap. Really, once that happens, now they look at that like this speeds up the permanency when it really, really doesn't.
Well, and I think in the same way, guys do too.
Oh, I agree.
Guys, when you have sex with someone, I'd say, younger years, maybe not, but older years, that there's an emotional bond being made with a woman.
Yeah.
A bond that is really deep for them if they're going to do that. Yeah. So I think you could in the same way say that guys get the bear trap as well. They just may not care as much about the bear trap as a woman does, or vice versa.
Yeah, and that's more than just an old wives' tale. I mean, it's even scientifically proven. There's a great book called Hooked that says that during sex, there's a chemical that's produced in the brain that's only produced at that time, and it's a bonding agent. I believe it's called oxy something. It's not oxy whatever the pain drug is.
Codeine.
But it's a chemical that's produced that really bonds you to that person, which, by the way, is brilliant. Why God would say not to have relations until you're married, because that's the bond you want. And so also, if I could reach back into a point in the past and talk about getting your mind right, sometimes you have to ask God to break all those bonds before you enter a new relationship, because I want to bond with this new person, so I have to go back, and that's part of the forgiveness process. So that's why you guard yourself, because it's more than just sex. It is confusing, and it's one of the major compromising agents as you move forward.
And so it's important to build that list, and that may be one thing that needs to be on there is sexual intimacy, again, emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy. Mm-hmm. There's that need for, I guess, very thorough points to that list.
Yeah.
So that really what it is you want and what you don't want before you start dating. Now, if you do this in the middle of a relationship,
excuse the data.
It does. You may say, okay, well, I don't want this, but you know what? The person I'm dating right now, they do it. I guess that's fine. It's not too bad, but maybe it's just the beginning of whatever that point is, and it could get worse from that point on. So build that list before you start dating, and guard yourself in the dating process. Make sure that you're taking care of number one.
Yeah.
You don't want to end up in those same positions or in a place of heartache again that you just felt with divorce.
Yeah.
I mean, we did say relationships and divorce feel the same way to kids.
Absolutely.
Well, they feel the same way to parents as well, or adults,
or people that love you. And which, to your point of finding a mentor, is I like to tell people they need to have a support group, because based on past experience and maybe some failures in relationships, I told a young lady that she would be a great catch. Her only fault is her chooser sucks. Now, That's not sucks is not a Greek word or a Baptist term, but she understood my point, and so I asked her to build a not just a mentor, but a support group, and that whenever she got a guy who got serious, she had to walk him through this support group. The poor guy had to go through like a gauntlet of a kangaroo court and get the thumbs up because she couldn't trust herself.
Yeah.
So she had to trust people who loved her too. And and by the way, that's also a good safeguard if you know. I have to take them by my support group, so that does keep you on the honest side of the equation.
It reminds me of Parks and Rec.
Of course it does.
Season 2 Halloween episode. And
to be specific,
yes, Anne brings her new boyfriend Mark Bandanowitz through
somebody watches a heck of a lot of TV
through her support group of nurse friends who basically tempt him to pick them over her, and he passes with flying colors, and therefore she starts dating him. But that's the cheesy, easy, weird, written way that happens.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it paints a good picture. You need a support group. You need people that you trust, people who are going to have your best interest at heart.
They see your blind sides. They know your weaknesses
Exactly.
that you don't see when you're in it. And so and that doesn't mean they get the final say on what you do, but it's got to be part of the data that you go over, before you make a big second decision.
Yeah. It's not just best friends who want to see you, because so often there's a lot of friends who want to see you happy again, who will even compromise your list for you.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that the people who are your support system are going to have your list in mind, not their emotional desires in mind.
Yeah. I created this little matrix. In fact, if you'd like a copy of it, you know how to get a hold of us, and Jeremy at the end of this podcast will tell you all the different ways you can get a hold of us. But it's really good to sit down with a person. It's a quadrant of 4, and it really helps you look at yourself. The first one is open. These are the things that you know about yourself and other people know. The second quadrant is blind side. So there's things that you don't know about yourself that other people see, and so this person helps you work through that. The third one are the hidden things. Those are the things you know about yourself that no one else knows, and if you expose those to good friends and accountability people, we take some of the power out. And the fourth part is just the unknown, and you're asking God to expose those unknown things to you, and maybe those unknown things about this person you're starting to date, and ask God to make some of these things clear to you. So if you'd like a copy of that, you'll know how to get hold of us at the end of this podcast.
Yes. And so we find ourselves that we've worked through our mess, we've worked through our unresolved issues, we've worked through the positive, the negative of who we are, and the characteristics that we don't want in a new dating relationship. Then we go through the dating process, and now we may get to a point where we say, hey, you know what? I found the person who completes me, who is a great partner for me, who is someone who I want to spend the rest of my life with. And you find yourself wanting to get remarried. And so there's some things that we want to look for there and make sure in the remarriage, and even a possible maybe they have kids and you have kids, and now you're blending two families together. And I think we talked at the beginning of the marriage series about when you get married, for instance, for me and my wife, is we had two ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. It was the way that she grew up and the way that I grew up, and now we're blending those two things together and finding out how we work together and start new traditions and start new ways of doing things, and how we set those expectations and all that. Well, now you're doing that on a family level, which is from what I can gather has to be even harder than that.
Yeah.
So as you get remarried and possibly blend your family, there's things that you need to know going into that.
Yeah, that's what the Bible calls counting the cost. Those are the plans you ought to have prior as opposed to in it, because you are blending two families. My joke is that, when you marry Bart, you get the Simpsons, but there's some truth to that. There's two families coming together, and what you're trying to do when a husband marries a wife is you're trying to create a sense of trust and unity. Well, it's not. It goes past just the bride and the groom. How do you how do you make a safe place of unity and togetherness and love based on two different sets of traditions and two different sets of doing things. And now your new partner isn't like mom or dad, and you don't realize how difficult that is for you being the newly married person to try to juggle all these balls at the same time. So the majority of my counseling with couples seems to revolve around the issues that are involved with blending families. So let me just share a few of them with you. And again, if you know they're a problem, they may be one that you have or that you know someone who's in this. So at least you could be aware of it. The first one is, I think you alluded to it, Jeremy, was step-parent discipline is a challenge. So if you're going to marry someone and become a family, then this person as well gets to be a disciplinarian. And it's hard, I'm sure, again, because we haven't experienced this on a personal level, I'm sure it's difficult to watch someone else discipline your child. So I think as you sit with your new spouse and you come up with not only what are we in agreement with in discipline, but what are the delivery styles going to look like as we discipline?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I've talked about this before in another podcast, but I mean, that's hard for us, Katie and I, just with each other.
Yeah.
Than with grandparents and, how that works out. Is getting everyone on the same page there is difficult, but important. And in the same vein, it is important here that you make sure you're on the same page. You don't want someone who is, if you're a person who is more of a talker and I'm disappointed in you, and that's what works with your kids. And then you have someone come in who's militant and forceful.
Yep.
That may not be a good compatibility match. And again, you need to watch out for your kids as you're moving into a dating relationship and into marriage, because they need that person to be someone who's compatible for them as well.
So from the child's perspective, when as you're trying to make your marriage work and you try to stand behind that new spouse who's disciplining your kids, from a child's perspective, it could look like total abandonment. You've left me and you care more about this guy. Or they notice that, how come you're easier on his kids than you are our kids?
Or it can feel like the substitute teacher kind of facade is, I can take advantage of my step parent because, they want to have a good relationship with my mom or my dad.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of going to take advantage of this situation and do what I want and get away with what I want because they don't know how to discipline me. They don't want to discipline me. They don't want to make my parent angry.
Yep.
And I've seen that before. I've had friends who their kids almost got them divorced a second time because of how they were taking advantage, and there wasn't a united front on how they were supposed to co-parent between parent and step-parent.
And sometimes that's the agenda. Maybe I can get them so mad at each other they'll divorce, and I can have my mom or dad back to me.
Yeah, definitely.
Another problem is now you're blending two families and two different lifestyles, and you find yourself with really a lack of resources. Finances are probably tough. You've just you might have combined two salaries and it just doesn't meet the end. And then there'll always be a squeaky wheel in the bunch. And that squeaky wheel, whatever child or multiple children, they seem to run the family. The loudest, most annoying child actually dictates the family on a daily basis. So what happens when you're lacking some resources? Maybe now because your child got to go to a swim camp, dance camp, checker camp, and all those. Now I don't even know if there is one. And if it is, if your kid wants to go to checker camp, you need to make an appointment with me. We need to talk with them. But so what happens when because we're as a family unit, we need to cut back on some of the things because there's a lack of resources. Let me just say to this point, and this is part of your planning in advance. It's never just a lack of resources. It's a lack of resourcefulness, because if you have to take some things away, there's some free things and some cheap things and some unifying things you could do to replace that not only just replaces one thing, but is also part of team building for the family. So probably the number one thing, if we were to prioritize, and what I hear is this sibling rivalry or a favoritism. The idea that you do favor your children a little bit more, or even it does the opposite, that you try so hard not to favor your child that you favor the other ones. I remember when I coached my son, and because I was the dad and he was the player, I think I went overboard and tried not to show favoritism to where it actually became counterproductive to our relationship. This happens. So at that point, if you built a plan that the other spouse, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have some debriefing meetings, just like you would in a business. How'd it go today? What did I do? What did you do? Hey, you could have done this. I mean, this is where communication is at its zenith. It's at the pinnacle of success when you have to fight through this sibling rivalry. And then you take each case individually and you try to find a way to work through it as a team. Sometimes it becomes good cop, bad cop, and the new spouse comes alongside and is that piece of healing. So again, each case is individual, each marriage is individual. The more you have a plan going into it, it increases the likelihood of success than trying to create one on the fly. And I think the last one is the feeling in the family, the environment that it's still two separate families. It's not unlike even relationships. Sometimes it's tragedies or something negative that draws us together, and I'm glad that happens. But there are positive ways you could do that too. So it's being intentional and preventive in advance to say we're going to try to create and give our new family every possibility to connect on all the cylinders. So, and I'm sure if you're out there and you're married and remarried and you have a blended family, you could probably add to this list. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just to show you before you enter in, you can't enter in flippantly and think, our kids get along wonderfully and famously before your marriage, because the minute they enter the same house, it changes. I wish it was always like the Brady Bunch, where the two families get together and they just love each other. But it doesn't. They didn't show all the hard work, and they didn't show all the pain that goes with for every one success, there are 5 painful failures. So again, the more you address going into it with a plan and a goal, the more likely you are to achieve success.
And so that's really the cycle, I think, coming off of divorce that some of you are going through. And so hopefully this was helpful to you guys. Again, before you date, before you jump back in, I'd say tiptoe back in, kind of test the water with your toe, and then maybe slowly come in from the steps instead of diving into the deep end with dating. But the important thing is making sure you resolve any issues, anything that may have been a side product of divorce that you don't even know about. Getting with a person that can help you through that, whether it be a counselor or a life coach or a pastor. And then once you're ready to date and once you've resolved those things, is really setting that list, guarding yourselves, guarding your kids, not letting your kids meet this person until it's a solid relationships that's going to continue. And then once you're ready to remarry, making sure that you go through these things and identify how you're going to parent, identify how you're going to work differently from your previous marriage, identify all the things that you need to do, and come up with almost, for lack of a better term, kind of a mission statement of how you're going to do all those things. Yeah. Those are the tangible things that you can do to hopefully work through divorce and into a single life, and maybe for some of you into a new marriage. We don't know if we covered everything. So if you feel like there's something that we missed, feel free to let us know. There's a couple places that you can let us know. One is on Facebook, facebook.com /RP podcast. We also have a Twitter, which is twitter.com @the RP podcast. And then on Instagram at Instagram, not at Instagram, at RP podcast. And then our website is always open and available as well for any listening to previous podcasts, to future podcasts, to getting a hold of us, and that is rppodcast.com. We are so glad that you listened, and hopefully it was impactful. Hopefully it was something that you can take away if you're in this situation, and hopefully that you can move forward with your walk in your journey, and hopefully bring you to a better place. Again, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.